Welcome to our channel. A cold wind sweeps across the endless plains, and tonight we drift into a world where winter was not a season but a sentence. You are about to step into the boots of those who faced the great blizzard of the Wild West not with heroism, but with quiet, grinding endurance. The year is 1886, and across the Dakota Territory a white silence is descending that will erase fortunes, lives, and the very myth of the frontier itself. But before we begin this gentle journey into that frozen world, I wonder what brought the cowboy out onto those plains in the first place, knowing winter could arrive like a judge passing sentence. Before we slip into this quiet passage through the blizzard's hold on the Wild West, I'd appreciate a small gesture. Tap that like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these late-night wanderings through forgotten corners of the past can continue to find you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what hour finds you here, some in the deep stillness of midnight, others greeting dawn or suspended somewhere beautifully in between. Now, perhaps dim your lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background for that gentle white noise, and let us settle together into tonight's slow drift through history's coldest chapter. You wake before dawn, though calling it waking suggests you ever truly slept. The bunkhouse walls groan and shift like the hull of a ship in heavy seas, and through every crack between the wooden planks, needles of frozen air find your face, your neck, the small of your back where your blanket has pulled away. It is January 1886, and you are somewhere in the Dakota Territory, though somewhere has lost all meaning. The blizzard that began 3 days ago has erased landmarks, erased distances, erased the difference between sky and ground. They will come to call this winter the Big Door, but right now you don't think in terms of history or names. You think only in terms of the next hour, the next task, the next small victory against the cold that wants to turn your blood to ice. You swing your legs off the wooden bunk and your boots stand where you left them, stiff as statues. The leather has frozen during the night, despite being near the stove, and when you try to pull them on, they resist like they've forgotten the shape of your feet. Around you, other cow hands are moving in the pre-dawn darkness, each man, a shadow, performing the same ritual of reassembly. No one speaks, because speaking requires energy, and energy is a currency you cannot afford to waste. The air inside the bunkhouse is thick with the smell of unwashed wool, leather that hasn't dried properly in weeks, and smoke that never quite escapes through the stovepipe. You breathe it in because you have no choice, and it coats your lungs with a film that makes every breath feel labored. Someone has managed to keep the stove alive through the night, though the fire is more memory than flame. You move toward it instinctively, joining the silent congregation of men who stand with their hands extended, waiting for sensation to return to their fingers. The coffee, when it comes, is thick enough to chew, made from grounds that have been used twice already and flavored with the metallic taste of snow melt. Water. You drink it anyway, wrapping both hands around the tin cup and letting the heat seep into your palms. Outside, the wind has not stopped for 72 hours. It doesn't gust or howl like winds you've known before. It maintains a constant, keening note, like the world itself is screaming. You pull on your coat, which is really 3 coats layered together, a canvas duster over a wool jacket, over a flannel shirt that used to be red, but is now the color of old blood and smoke. The outermost layer is stiff with frozen sweat, and it crackles when you move, announcing your presence. With every step, your scarf wraps around your face until only your eyes are exposed, and even then you'll keep them mostly closed against the wind. You've learned that the cold finds moisture, tears, breath, the slight dampness at the corner of your mouth and turns it to ice. The door opens, and the wind rushes in like something that has been waiting, hungry and patient for a moment. The world outside is completely white, and you cannot tell if you're looking at snow falling or snow already fallen and now being thrown back into the air. You step out and the cold hits you with a physical force. It's not the clean, bracing cold of autumn mornings, but something denser, something that presses against your chest and makes your lungs ache with every breath. The bunkhouse sits at the edge of what used to be visible prairie, but now there is only white in every direction. The corral posts emerge from snow drifts like the masts of sunken ships, and between them the horses stand with their backs to the wind, their manes thick with frost. You move toward them each step, a negotiation with the snow that has drifted waist-deep in places. Your legs burn with the effort, and you think about the fact that you'll be making this same walk a dozen times today and tomorrow and the day after, for as long as the blizzard lasts. The horses turn their heads as you approach, and you see ice crystallized on their eyelashes, in their nostrils, along the edges of their mouths, where breath has condensed and frozen. They look at you with an expression that is neither accusing nor hopeful, just patient, as if they've accepted something you're still fighting against. You begin the work of checking them, running your hands along their backs, their legs, feeling for injuries or signs of foundering. Your hands, even through thick gloves, can barely feel anything, and you worry that you might miss something important, some small wound that in this cold could turn fatal overnight. One of the mares has a patch of ice matted into her coat where she lay down during the night, and you know you should chip it away. But your fingers are too numb. You make a mental note to return with warmer hands, knowing you probably won't. Knowing this kind of small neglect is how things fall apart. Out here, the saddles hang on the corral fence, each one covered in a fine layer of snow that has found its way through every crack and opening. You brush yours off and the leather beneath is so cold it feels like metal, so stiff it barely bends. Saddling a horse in this cold is an act of quiet violence. The cinch strap resists, the buckles won't close properly and the horse shifts and stamps because the frozen leather against its belly is like being pressed with ice. You murmur to her as you work, not words exactly, just sounds meant to be soothing. Your voice comes out muffled through the scarf, and you wonder if she can even hear you over the wind or if she's just tolerating your presence because she has no other choice. When you finally mount the saddle cars beneath you, and you feel the cold even through your layers of clothing, the horse moves reluctantly, each step measured, as if she's calculating the energy cost of every movement. You ride out toward where the herd should be, though ride out makes it sound like a journey with direction and purpose. Really, you're just moving into the white, hoping your sense of direction hasn't been completely erased by the storm. The other cow hands are out here somewhere, spread across what used to be recognizable terrain. You might pass within 10 feet of another rider and never know it. The visibility is that poor. The cattle, when you finally find them, are huddled together in a mass that looks more like a single organism than individual animals. They've packed themselves so tightly that the ones in the middle might actually be warm, but the ones on the outside are bearing the full force of the wind. You circle them slowly, counting, though you know your count will be incomplete. Some have already drifted away into the storm, following some instinct that leads them away from the herd and toward isolated death. The ones that remain are covered in ice, their coats transformed into frozen shells. When they move, you can hear the ice cracking, a sound like breaking glass that somehow carries even over the wind. Your job is to keep them moving, to prevent them from standing still long enough to freeze completely or to pile up in drifts where they'll suffocate under the weight of their own numbers. But moving them requires getting them to care about survival, and you can see in their eyes that some of them have already stopped caring. You push them gently, using your horse to nudge the stragglers, speaking to them in that same low murmur you used on your mare. Some respond, taking a few reluctant steps, while others just stare at you with frost-rimmed eyes. The work continues for hours, or what feels like hours. Time has become unreliable out here, measured only by the slow ache building in your legs, your back, your shoulders. At some point, someone passes you a piece of hardtack from their saddlebag, and you eat it without tasting it. The act of chewing is difficult because your jaw is so cold it doesn't want to move properly. You find yourself thinking about the last hot meal you ate, trying to remember what it tasted like. Did it beef beans? You can't recall, and the not remembering bothers you more than the cold does. The wind shifts and for a moment, just a moment, you can see farther than 10 feet. In that brief window of visibility you spot another rider in the distance, a dark shape against the white, and you feel a surge of something that might be relief or might just be recognition that you're not completely alone out here. Then the wind shifts again, and he's gone, and you wonder if you imagined him out here. The line between what's real and what your mind creates to comfort itself has become very thin. You find a dead calf, half buried in a snowdrift, its body already stiff. You should drag it away from the herd, but you don't have the strength, and besides, by tomorrow it will be completely covered and no one will know it was ever there. This is what they don't tell you about the cowboy life, about the romance of the open range. They don't tell you about the mathematics of death, about counting the losses and calculating whether the herd will survive until spring. They don't tell you about the cold that gets inside you and never completely leaves. Even when you're back in the bunkhouse, even when you're pressed against the stove, it takes up residence in your bones and makes itself at home. Midday arrives without any change in the light. The sky remains the same gray-white it's been since the storm began, and you realize you've lost track of whether it's actually snowing or whether the wind is just redistributing snow that fell yesterday or the day before. Your horse stumbles, catches herself, continues on. You feel her exhaustion through the saddle, feel how each step is becoming harder for her. You should probably head back, give her a rest, give yourself a rest. But heading back means admitting the day's work is done, and you're not sure if you've done enough to justify calling it a day. Besides, back has become a theoretical concept. You think you know where the bunkhouse is, but you've been wrong about directions before out here, and the consequences of being wrong in a blizzard are not abstract. Another cowhand materializes out of the white, close enough this time that you can see his face, though most of it is hidden behind a scarf crusted with ice. He nods at you, and you nod back, and that's all the communication you have energy for. He's moving a small group of cattle, maybe a dozen, pushing them in what you assume is the right direction. They move like sleepwalkers, placing one hoof in front of another without any apparent awareness of where they're going. You fall in behind him, adding your presence to his effort, and together you move this small portion of the herd through the endless white. It's not much, but it's something, and out here, something is everything. The afternoon wears on, though calling it afternoon is just habit. The light never changes, the wind never stops, and you begin to feel like you've been out here forever, like there was never a time before this storm. Your hands have gone beyond cold into a kind of numbness that is almost peaceful. You can still move, your fingers still hold the reins, but you can't feel them anymore, and there's a part of your mind that knows this is dangerous, but can't quite muster the concern to do anything about it. You think about the letters in your saddlebag, written weeks ago and never sent because there's been no way to send them. One is to your mother, one is to a girl you knew back in Texas, and one is to no one in particular. Just words you needed to write down. They're frozen now, the paper stiff, the ink probably smudged from moisture that seeped in and then froze. You wonder if they'll ever be readable, if anyone will ever know what you tried to say. A sudden gust of wind nearly knocks you from the saddle, and you grab the horn to steady yourself. Your horse skitters sideways, and for a moment you think you're going down, but she recovers her footing and you stay mounted. That's when you see it, a shape in the snow that isn't a cow or a drift or another rider. It's a horse lying on its side, its rider crouched beside it. You approach slowly, and as you get closer you realize the horse is dead, frozen where it fell, and the rider is trying to salvage his saddle and gear before they freeze to the carcass. He looks up at you as you approach, and even through his scarf you can see the defeat in his eyes. Losing a horse out here isn't just losing an animal. It's losing your mobility, your ability to work, possibly your ability to survive. You gesture to your own horse, offering to carry his gear, and he nods, too exhausted or too proud to speak together. You load his saddle onto your mare, and he takes the reins to walk alongside you back toward camp. The walk is long and silent. The only sounds are the wind, the creak of leather, the crunch of snow under boots and hooves. You pass other riders, other small groups of cattle, all moving through the same white world with the same grim determination. No one asks how it's going, because everyone already knows. By the time you finally see the dark shape of the bunkhouse emerging from the white, you've been in the saddle for what must be 10 or 12 hours, though it feels both shorter and longer than that. You help the other cowhand stable his gear, then tend to your own horse, rubbing her down as best you can with numb hands, making sure she has access to what hay remains inside the bunkhouse. The scene is the same as this morning, men gathered around the stove, speaking in low voices or not speaking at all, drinking coffee that tastes like metal and smoke. You take your place among them, peeling off layers of frozen clothing, and as sensation returns to your hands and feet. The pain is extraordinary. It's like being stabbed with 1,000 needles, and you breathe through it, jaw clenched, until it passes. Someone hands you a plate of beans, cold and thick, and you eat them with a spoon that clinks against the tin. The beans are gritty with sand because there's no way to properly clean cooking gear in this weather, but you eat them anyway because calories are survival. The surrounding conversations are fragmented, half-finished thoughts about lost cattle, injured horses, the relentlessness of the wind. No one complains directly, because complaining is bad luck, but the complaints are there in every pause, every sigh. You think about lying down, about sleeping, but you know that in a few hours you'll have to go back out for the night check. So instead you sit letting the warmth from the stove seep into your bones, and you stare at the frost forming on the inside of the windows. Someone plays a harmonica, a slow, mournful tune that sounds like the wind itself. No one asks him to stop, but no one joins in either. You close your eyes just for a moment, and at that moment you're somewhere else, somewhere warm, somewhere the air doesn't hurt to breathe, somewhere you can remember what your hands felt like before the cold claimed them. But then someone says, "It's time for the night check," and you open your eyes and pull your frozen coat back on. Outside, the wind is still screaming, the snow is still falling, and the cattle are still dying in the endless white. You step back into the storm because that's what you do. You step back into it because the alternative is letting the entire herd die, and with it any chance of payment, of continuing this life, of proving that you can endure what the West demands. The night is darker than the day, if that's even possible in a storm where light has become a distant memory. You ride with your hand outstretched in front of you, feeling for obstacles you can't see. The cattle are still huddled where you left them, or where you think you left them. It's hard to be sure when everything looks the same. You circle them again, counting again, knowing the count will be lower than this morning. Some have wandered off, some have lain down and not gotten back up, and some have simply vanished into the white as if they never existed. Your horse moves like a ghost beneath you, barely making a sound. You wonder if she's thinking what? You're thinking that this cannot possibly continue, that at some point the storm must break, that survival must mean more than this endless repetition of cold and loss. But the storm doesn't break, the wind doesn't stop, and you keep riding, because stopping means freezing, and freezing means becoming another shape in the snow for someone else to find. Hours pass, or maybe minutes. You've lost the ability to tell the difference. At some point you realize you're talking to yourself, or maybe to your horse, or maybe to the storm itself. The words don't matter, it's just sound, just proof that you're still alive, still capable of making noise in this silent white world. When you finally return to the bunkhouse, the sky is lightening almost imperceptibly in the east. Dawn is coming, which means you've survived another night, which means you get to do this all over again. Inside, you strip off your layers and hang them to dry, though in this humidity nothing really dries, it just becomes less frozen. You fall into your bunk without eating, without speaking, and sleep claims you like a predator. But even in sleep you dream of cold, of wind, of shapes moving through endless white. And when you wake, too soon, always too soon, the wind is still screaming, the snow is still falling, and the work continues as it always has, as it perhaps always will. This is what it means to be a cowboy in a blizzard, not glory, not adventure, but the quiet grinding down of everything you thought you were, until all that remains is the simple, terrible fact of your own endurance. In the same winter, in the same white silence, there is a man who carries the weight of more than his own survival. Charles Goodnight, born 49 years earlier in Illinois, stands at the window of his ranch house watching his life's work disappear beneath the snow. He came west in 1836 with nothing, or close enough to nothing that it makes no difference in the telling. What he had was restlessness and a conviction that the frontier would reward those willing to endure its particular cruelties. For decades that conviction had proven true. He had carved trails through territories that had no trails, negotiated with Comanche war parties, survived droughts and stampedes and all the casual violence the West offered. The Goodnight Loving Trail, named for him, and his partner, Oliver Loving, had moved hundreds of thousands of cattle from Texas to the railheads in Wyoming and Colorado. It had made fortunes, created industries, drawn maps where before there had only been blank spaces. But now, in January 1887, all of that means nothing. The blizzard that began weeks ago has continued without mercy, and every day, Goodnight watches his herd, his legacy, shrink. His ranch hands come in from the range with reports that are all variations on the same theme: more dead cattle, more lost cattle, more cattle standing listless in the snow waiting for death to find them. He listens to each report with the same expression, betraying nothing, because that's what leadership requires out here, but at night, alone in his study, he does the mathematics. Each dead steer represents not just money lost, but years of work, erased, careful breeding, undone plans for expansion that will now never happen. The storm has already killed more cattle than he can afford to lose, and it shows no signs of stopping. Other ranchers have already pulled their men back, ridden off their herds, focused on keeping their own people alive. Goodnight refuses. Every morning he rides out with his men searching for cattle that might still be saved, moving them to whatever shelter the land offers, which is never enough. His wife Mary watches him leave each dawn, and in her eyes he sees a question. She doesn't ask, "When will you admit this is a fight you cannot win?" He doesn't have an answer, so he just tips his hat and rides out into the white. The men who work for him are loyal, but loyalty has its limits. They follow him into the storm because he pays their wages and because they respect what he's built. But he can see the doubt growing in their eyes. One evening, a young cowhand named Thompson comes to him with a simple question: "Mr. Goodnight, sir, what are we doing out there?" The question hangs in the air like frost. Goodnight considers his answer carefully. He could talk about financial investment, about preserving what can be preserved, about duty and responsibility. But what he says instead is this: "Those cattle are depending on us same as you're depending on me for your wages." It's not entirely true, and they both know it. Cattle don't depend on anything except instinct. But it's the truth that makes sense out here. Thompson nods and doesn't ask again. The next morning he's back in the saddle, riding into the storm alongside the others. The days blend together in an endless repetition of cold and loss. Goodnight rides with his men, though at 49 he feels every year of it in this weather, feels his joints protesting the long hours in the saddle. Feels the cold settling deeper into his bones than it did 20 years ago. He finds his cattle in groups and alone, living and dead, scattered across the range like seeds thrown by an angry god. The living ones he tries to move toward shelter, though shelter is a relative term in this open country. The dead ones he counts, keeping a mental tally that grows more depressing each day. Some have frozen standing up ice, encasing them so completely they look like sculptures, monuments to their own suffering. Others have piled together for warmth and died in heaps, their bodies frozen into grotesque tangles of limbs and horns. His men have taken to calling these gatherings death drifts, and the name is apt enough that it sticks. One afternoon, Goodnight comes across a group of his cattle that have found a small ravine offering minimal protection from the wind. They're standing there, 30 or 40 of them, ice-crusted on their backs, waiting. He dismounts and walks among them, running his hands along their frozen flanks, looking into their eyes for signs of vigor or resignation. Most just stare back at him with that same patient expression, as if they've accepted their fate and are merely waiting for it to arrive. There's a young bull in the group, one of his breeding stock, a fine animal with good lines that should have sired hundreds of calves. The bull's legs are shaking, and Goodnight knows he won't last another night. For a long moment he considers shooting the bull, putting it out of its misery. His hand even moves toward the rifle on his saddle before he stops himself. What stops him isn't mercy or hope, but something more complicated, the recognition that shooting the bull would be an admission that it's all over, that there's no point in trying anymore. And he's not ready to make that admission, not yet. So he leaves the bull standing there and remounts his horse and rides away without looking back. By morning the bull is dead, frozen in the same spot where Goodnight last saw him. The losses pile up like snow, 50 head, 100, 200. The numbers become almost abstract, too large to comprehend as individual animals with individual deaths. Goodnight keeps a ledger in his study where he records the losses, writing each number in neat columns. The ink freezes in the bottle overnight, so each morning he has to warm it by the fire before he can write. Mary tells him to stop keeping the ledger, that it's only making things worse, that he needs to focus on what can be saved rather than mourning what's already lost. She's right, of course, but he continues writing the numbers anyway because stopping would feel like abandoning them a second time. The other ranchers in the territory are experiencing similar losses. Goodnight hears reports through the occasional rider who makes it through the storm. The Swan Land and Cattle Company has lost over 80% of its herd. The Powder River outfits are facing complete ruin. Some smaller operations have simply ceased to exist. It's not just the cattle dying. The men are suffering too. Frostbite claims fingers and toes. Exhaustion leads to accidents, and there are whispered stories of cow hands who rode out one morning and never came back, their bodies still lying somewhere in the endless white. Goodnight makes it a point to know every man who works for him, to remember their names and where they're from. When one of them doesn't return from the range, he takes it personally. A cowhand named Sullivan disappears during a particularly bad stretch of the storm. Goodnight leads the search party, himself writing grid patterns through the snow for 3 days before they find Sullivan's body curled against a rock, frozen solid. They dig his grave in ground that resists the shovel hard as iron. The funeral is brief because there's work to be done, but Goodnight speaks a few words about duty and sacrifice and the men listen with their heads bowed. That night he writes a letter to Sullivan's mother in Missouri, telling her that her son died doing important work, that he was brave and reliable, that he'll be remembered. None of it is a lie exactly, but it feels like one anyway. The winter continues its assault without strategy or mercy. Goodnight develops a routine that borders on ritual: wake before dawn, ride out at first light, spend 12 hours in the saddle, return at dark, eat without tasting, sleep without resting, repeat. His hands, which, once roped and branded with easy confidence, are now stiff and clumsy. He drops things, tools resist, and this loss of dexterity bothers him more than he admits. Mary puts salve on his hands each night, warming them between her own, and doesn't comment on how much older they look than they did at the start of winter. She doesn't need to, he can see it himself. One evening, after a particularly brutal day that claimed 30 head in a single drift, Goodnight sits in his study and allows himself a moment of honest assessment. The ranch will survive, probably, but it won't be what it was. The herd he spent decades building is gone or going. The plans for expansion are finished. The dream of creating a cattle empire that would last generations is dead in the snow with his steers, and yet the next morning he pulls on his frozen coat and rides out again, not because he thinks he can still win, but because surrender is not in his vocabulary. His cowboys watch him ride out ahead of them, this 50-year-old man who should know better, who should have cut his losses weeks ago. And they follow him, not because they think there's any point to it anymore, but because that's what loyalty looks like. In late February, the storm finally breaks, the wind stops, the snow ceases, and the sky clears to a blue so bright it hurts to look at. Goodnight and his men ride out to assess the damage in full daylight for the first time in weeks. What they find is a landscape transformed into a graveyard. Dead cattle are everywhere, in ravines, along fence lines, scattered across the open range in positions that suggest they were trying to outrun the cold. The count, when it's finally complete, confirms what Goodnight already knew: he's lost 60% of his herd. For other ranchers the losses are worse, 70, 80, 90%. Some have lost everything. The blizzard that will be remembered as the Big Door has reshaped the entire cattle industry in a single winter. Goodnight stands in the spring sunshine looking at the carcasses that will have to be cleared, the fences that will need repair, the years of work that will be required to rebuild what the winter has destroyed. And what he feels is not anger or despair, but something quieter: acceptance. He had believed, as most men do, that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. The blizzard taught him otherwise. Nature is not an obstacle to be overcome, but a force to be endured, and sometimes the only victory is survival. His cattle are gone, but his ranch remains, his men remain, and he remains. In the end, that will have to be enough, because in the West, surviving is its own kind of triumph, and Charles Goodnight is, above all else, a survivor. Years after the Great Blizzard, when the frontier has closed and the cowboy era has passed into myth, archaeologists walk the high plains of the Dakota Territory and find things that don't quite make sense. These are the ghost fires, circles of charred stone and blackened earth appearing in patterns across the landscape like ancient messages written in ash. The frontier has become memory by then, transformed into something softer and stranger than it was when men lived it. The open range has been fenced, the buffalo are gone, and the railroads have stitched the continent together with iron thread. The cowboys themselves have mostly vanished, absorbed into cities or settled onto small parcels of land that seem impossibly confined after the vastness they once knew. Their stories have already begun the process of mythologization, filtered through dime novels and Wild West shows, until the truth becomes indistinguishable from invention. But the land remembers what the stories cannot capture. It holds evidence of what actually happened, preserved in soil and stone, waiting for those with eyes trained to read such things. The first ones are discovered by accident in 1934, during a drought that lowers the topsoil and reveals what has been hidden. A graduate student from the University of Montana, mapping Lakota burial sites, stumbles across a perfect circle of fire-blackened stones arranged with geometric precision. Her name is Sarah Whitmore, and she has spent 3 weeks alone on the plains, documenting sites that are slowly being lost to agriculture and erosion. She is methodical in her work, trained to observe without interpretation, to collect data without imposing narrative. But this circle stops her in her tracks. The stones are too deliberately placed, their spacing too regular, their arrangement too purposeful to be natural. She notes it in her field journal, makes a sketch and continues with her original work. But that night, camped on the plains under stars that seem too bright, she can't stop thinking about those stones, about the intentionality of their arrangement. The prairie at night is not silent, despite what people imagine. It murmurs with wind, clicks with insects, rustles with the passage of small creatures through grass. Whitmore lies in her tent and listens to these sounds, and she thinks about the hands that placed those stones. She thinks about fire and darkness and the reasons people might need to mark their presence in such a permanent way. Over the following weeks she finds more circles, 7 in total, all within a 30 m radius, all of similar diameter, all facing southeast. She measures each one carefully, takes photographs from multiple angles, collects samples of the charred material she finds within some of them. The consistency of the pattern is what fascinates her most. This is not random, not accidental, not the result of natural processes. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental, too widespread to be the work of a single campsite. She writes to her professor describing what she's found, asking if he knows of any Native American tradition that might explain these fire circles. She includes her sketches and measurements, her notes about the southeastern orientation, her observations about the way grass grows differently in and around the circles. Furthermore, she tries to keep her tone neutral, academic, but excitement bleeds through her formal language. His response is puzzled. The Lakota used fire ceremonially, yes, but not in these patterns. And besides, the char on the stones appears relatively recent decades, not centuries. He suggests that perhaps these are the remains of surveyor camps or markers left by railroad scouts, or even elaborate hoaxes. But none of these explanations quite fit the evidence. The professor recommends she contact colleagues who are working on other sites across the northern plains to see if similar formations have been documented elsewhere. This correspondence will take months, conducted through letters that travel slowly across the distances she is studying. But Whitmore is patient and methodical and increasingly convinced that what she has found matters in ways she cannot yet articulate. She extends her field season, camping through the early autumn searching for more circles. The mystery deepens when other archaeologists working in different parts of the northern plains begin finding similar formations. By 1940, over 200 ghost fires have been documented across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. The term ghost fires emerge organically from the archaeological community, a poetic label for something that resists more scientific classification. Some scholars object to the romanticism of the name, preferring neutral descriptors like stone circle formations or historical fire sites. But the label sticks, perhaps because it captures something essential about these places, the way they seem haunted not by spirits but by the absence of explanations. They are evidence of presence that has become absence, of heat that has cooled to memory. They vary in diameter from 6 to 12 feet, but the southeastern orientation is almost universal. Some contain artifacts, rusted horseshoes, fragments of canvas, melted glass that might once have been bottles or lantern fixtures. A team from the University of Wyoming catalogs the artifacts with painstaking care, noting the types of metal used, the styles of manufacture, the likely dates of production. These objects tell a story of frontier life, its tools and necessities, its mundane realities beneath the mythic surface. Coffee tins appear in several sites, their labels long since degraded, but their shapes recognizable. Buttons made of bone or horn, the kind that would have fastened wool coats against the cold. Fragments of horseshoes worn thin by miles of travel across stone and hard-backed earth, these are the detritus of working life, not the grand adventure of frontier mythology. One site in South Dakota yields a particularly haunting find, a circle of stones with a cavalry spur buried at its center. The metal so corroded it crumbles when touched. The date on a nearby coin suggests placement around 1886 or 1887. The spur is military issue, identifiable by its distinctive row pattern despite the corrosion. But there is no other military equipment in the vicinity, no buttons or buckles or insignia that might indicate a soldier's grave. The coin is a silver dollar, minted in 1885. Its surface worn smooth by handling before it was buried. Whether it was placed deliberately as an offering or simply lost during some desperate scramble, no one can say with certainty. The timing aligns perfectly with the big die-up and a theory begins to emerge. These are the last camps of cowboys who died in the blizzard. The circles mark where men built final desperate fires, where they gathered stones to contain what little heat they could generate, where they arranged themselves to face the sunrise they hoped would come. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was catastrophic across the northern plains, killing millions of cattle and ending the era of open-range ranching. Men died too, caught in storms that lasted for days, temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero, wind that made breathing feel like drowning. The historical record contains glimpses of this disaster, newspaper accounts, ranch ledgers showing devastating losses, occasional diary entries that speak of frozen cattle stacked like cordwood. But the human cost is harder to quantify, especially among the cowboys, who left few written records of their own lives. Many simply disappeared that winter, their fates unknown. Some were found months later, when the snow melted, their bodies, preserved by cold, still sitting upright against trees or rock formations where they had sought shelter. But if that theory is true, questions remain. Why are so many circles identical in size and orientation? Why are some found in locations too barren to support cattle, suggesting they weren't herder camps at all. The cattle trails of the 1880s are well documented, mapped by both the ranchers who used them and the government surveyors who came after. Yet several ghost fire sites appear miles away from any established trail, in areas where no sensible over would have taken a herd. This geographical anomaly troubles researchers. If the fires mark death camps from the blizzard, they should cluster along known routes, near water sources, in places where cattle might realistically graze. Instead, some appear in the most desolate locations imaginable: high plateaus with no shelter, alkali flats where nothing grows, rocky badlands that offered neither fuel nor protection. The distribution suggests either random wandering during the storm or some other purpose entirely. A retired rancher named William Haskell, interviewed in 1941, offers a different explanation. His father rode with Charles Goodnight during the blizzard of '86, and he remembers the old man talking about signal fires. Haskell is 93 years old when the interview takes place, his memory sharp for events from his youth but fuzzy on recent decades. He speaks slowly, choosing his words with care, describing conversations that happened more than 50 years before. Charles Goodnight was legendary even then, a cattleman who had helped establish the trails that opened Texas to Colorado markets. If Goodnight's riders used signal fires during the blizzard, that knowledge would have spread quickly through the cowboy community. According to Haskell, cowboys caught in the storm would build fires in specific patterns to mark that they'd survived the night. The southeastern orientation wasn't religious or symbolic. It was practical, designed to catch the first light of dawn, so other riders could spot the smoke. Dawn comes from the southeast during winter in the northern latitudes, the sun rising at an angle that would illuminate smoke from miles away. A fire built to face that direction would announce survival to anyone watching, would serve as a beacon for scattered men trying to regroup. The stones were arranged in circles, not for ceremony but for efficiency, creating a windbreak that would keep the fire alive through the worst of the storm. And the identical sizing wasn't supernatural, it was simply the diameter that men had learned through experience would provide maximum warmth without consuming too much fuel. A 6-foot circle would accommodate 2 or 3 men lying in proximity to the fire, close enough to share heat, but not so close as to risk being burned in their exhausted sleep. 12 feet would serve a larger group, perhaps a whole outfit caught together when the storm hit too small and the stones would radiate heat inward too intensely, making it impossible to rest too large, and the fire would fail to warm adequately, burning through fuel without providing sufficient protection from the cold. It's a practical explanation, and it satisfies the academics who prefer their mysteries solved with logic. But it doesn't account for everything. The theory of signal fires and survival camps provides a framework, a way to understand most of what the archaeologists are finding. University papers cite Haskell's interview, incorporating cowboy pragmatism into their interpretations of the evidence. But exceptions keep appearing, sites that don't quite fit the pattern, anomalies that resist integration into the comfortable narrative of practical survival. Some circles contain things that have no practical purpose, patterns of small stones arranged within the larger circle, coins placed at specific intervals around the perimeter, bones that aren't cattle or horses but smaller animals, coyotes, prairie dogs, rabbits, arranged with clear intentionality. At a site in eastern Montana, excavators find a perfect spiral of white pebbles laid out within a larger stone circle. The pebbles are quartzite, distinctive and gleaming, not native to that immediate area. Someone gathered them deliberately, carried them to this place, arranged them in a pattern that took time and effort. This happened during a blizzard severe enough to kill cattle by the thousands. Yet someone found the time and energy for this act of arrangement. In Wyoming, a circle contains 13 coins placed at regular intervals along its inner circumference. Each coin face up, each bearing a different date. The dates span from 1877 to 1886, as if each coin represents a year, as if the arrangement marks the passage of time or commemorates events known only to whoever placed them. The animal bones are even stranger. They appear in perhaps 1 out of every 10 circles. Always small mammals, always arranged in some deliberate fashion, crossing each other at right angles, radiating outward from a central point, laid parallel like the rungs of a ladder. A folklorist named Ellen Morris becomes obsessed with these anomalies. She spends 3 summers in the 1950s camping on the plains, interviewing elderly ranchers and their descendants, collecting stories that have been passed down through generations. Morris is trained as an anthropologist but works on the fringes of academia, more interested in lived experience than in statistical analysis. She carries a tape recorder everywhere, documenting conversations in voices that will be dead within a decade. The ranchers trust her in a way they never trusted the university archaeologists, perhaps because she doesn't arrive with theories she wants to prove. She simply listens, drinks coffee at kitchen tables, sits on porch steps during long summer evenings while old men talk. What she finds is a subtle blending of cultures, a quiet exchange between the cowboys who worked the land and the native peoples who had lived there for centuries. The cowboys, despite their reputation as conquerors, absorbed more than they displaced. The history books emphasize conflict, the Indian Wars, the buffalo slaughter, the forced relocations onto reservations. All of this happened undeniably, tragically. But alongside the violence, something else occurred. Cowboys and native people worked together on ranches, shared campsites and water sources, exchanged knowledge about surviving in a landscape that killed the unprepared, the skills that kept. Cowboys alive reading weather signs, finding water in drought, navigating by stars and landforms. These had been perfected over generations by the Plains tribes. The smart cowboys learned these skills, absorbed them, made them their own. Several of her informants mentioned snow spirits, entities said to follow travelers through whiteout conditions. The spirits weren't necessarily malevolent, but they were disorienting, leading men away from safety, making familiar landmarks unrecognizable. The Lakota had names for these spirits, complex beliefs about their nature and purpose, ceremonies designed to protect against their influence. But the concept traveled beyond tribal boundaries, simplified and transformed by cowboys who understood only that something dangerous haunted blizzards. One old rancher tells Morris about his grandfather getting lost in a storm and hearing voices calling him in different directions. The grandfather knew somehow that following those voices would mean death, so he stopped moving entirely and built his fire where he stood. To protect against snow spirits you needed to create sacred space. The fire circle provided this protection, but only if built correctly, facing southeast toward the sun's rebirth. Stones placed at intervals that matched the constellations, visible overhead, offerings left for the spirits in the form of food or tobacco or coins. This is where practical survival and ritual practice become impossible to separate. A fire facing southeast catches better light, yes, but it also aligns with symbolic meanings about renewal and the return of warmth. Stones placed to mirror star patterns create an efficient windbreak, true, but they also invoke celestial protection, bind earthly space to cosmic order. The coin offered to spirits might also serve as a marker for human rescuers, a gleaming object that catches light and attention. Morris documents dozens of stories about cowboys surviving the blizzard through these semi-magical practices, men who swore they heard voices in the wind giving them directions, who found shelter in places that shouldn't have existed, who felt the presence of their horses, guiding them even after the animals had died. A man named Caleb Jensen tells her about seeing his dead horse walking ahead of him through the snow, leading him to a cave he had never noticed before, despite riding that range for 3 years. He followed the ghost horse inside and survived 2 days there before the storm broke. Another informant describes building his fire and falling into what he thought was sleep, but might have been something else. In this state, he saw figures moving around his fire, people he didn't recognize but who seemed familiar, who kept the flames fed while he rested. When he woke, his fire was still burning strong. His wood pile diminished, though he had no memory of rising to feed it. He found footprints in the snow around his circle, but they disappeared after a few yards leading nowhere. She publishes her findings in 1962 under the title Ghost Fires Cowboy Cosmology on the Northern Plains. The academic community largely dismisses it as folklore. Interesting but ultimately unscientific. The reviews are polite but skeptical, praising Morris's thoroughness while questioning her methodology. How can oral histories collected decades after events be considered reliable evidence? The stories are compelling, the reviewers admit, but they prove nothing about what actually happened during the blizzard. Human memory is fallible, prone to embellishment and revision, especially when dealing with traumatic experiences that have been retold many times. But the ranchers read it and they nod. And they tell their own stories of things experienced but never adequately explained, the time a grandfather rode through a blizzard following what he swore was a wolf, only to find himself at his own barn door. The book sells modestly but steadily, passed from hand to hand across the rural West. Ranch wives keep copies in their kitchens, mark passages that remind them of stories their own grandparents told. Young people read it and feel something shift in their understanding of the past, recognizing that history might be stranger and more complex than the textbooks suggest. The Cowboys emerge from Morris's pages not as simple men doing simple work, but as people navigating multiple worlds, practical and spiritual, scientific and magical, individual and communal. The way certain spots on the range always feel different, colder somehow, even on summer days. The fact that cattle avoid specific areas without any visible reason, circling around invisible boundaries that seem to mean something only to them. These observations accumulate over years of ranching, become part of the unofficial knowledge passed from one generation to the next. You don't graze cattle in certain drawers not because anything bad happened there specifically, but because they just don't settle right in those places. Horses sometimes refuse to cross particular stretches of ground, bulking and snorting as if they sense something threatening. Dogs will bark at empty spaces, hackles raised responding to stimuli invisible to human senses. Modern archaeology has become more sophisticated, using ground-penetrating radar and carbon dating to analyze the ghost fires with scientific precision. What they've confirmed is both mundane and mysterious. The fires date to the 1880s. They were built by humans, and they served some purpose related to survival. The technology reveals layers invisible to surface examination. Beneath some circles lie older fire sites, suggesting these locations were used repeatedly, perhaps marking places that offered particular advantages during storms. Carbon dating confirms that most fires burn hot and fast, consistent with desperate attempts to stay warm, rather than the slow, sustained fires of casual camping. The chemical composition of ash suggests primarily sage, brush and cottonwood, whatever could be gathered quickly. Ground-penetrating radar shows that some circles sit at top, minor geological anomalies, underground water flows, mineral deposits, cavities in limestone that might offer slight protection from wind. Perhaps the sites were chosen with unconscious awareness of these features, an intuition about place that preceded scientific understanding, but purpose and meaning are not the same thing. A fire built for warmth is also a fire built for hope, a declaration against the darkness that says, I am still here, I have not given up. I will see the morning. Every fire is multiple things simultaneously, it is chemistry and symbolism, physics and prayer. The cowboy gathering stones with frozen hands are performing a practical task, yes, but he is also enacting something ancient, the human impulse to mark territory, to claim space, to impose order on chaos. The arrangement of those stones transforms random earth into meaningful place. In this sense, the ghost fires are not really mysterious at all. They're simply evidence of what people do when pushed to their limits. They create ritual, they impose order on chaos, they build small monuments to their own endurance. The impulse exists across all cultures and all times. Climbers leave cans on mountain peaks. Travelers carve initials into trees. The dying leave messages for whoever might come after. These acts say, I was here, I mattered, even briefly. Witness what I did with my handful of hours on earth. You can visit some of these sites even now, if you know where to look. They're marked on archaeological survey maps, protected by state historical societies, slowly being reclaimed by the prairie grass. Access requires permission and sometimes fees. The sites managed, like the historical resources. They are small. Signs explain what visitors are seeing, provide context, and dates suggest interpretations. But the signs cannot capture what it feels like to stand in these circles, cannot convey the weight of presence that lingers in these places. The plaques offer facts, while the stones offer something else entirely, an invitation to imagine, to feel across time. Standing in one of these circles, especially at dawn when the light comes from the southeast, as it always has, you can almost feel the presence of those who stood here before, not ghosts exactly, but echoes, the residue of human stubbornness in the face of annihilation. The quality of light at dawn on the plains is unlike light anywhere else, thin and cold and immensely clear, revealing vast distances with ruthless precision. Standing in a ghost fire circle at dawn is to see exactly what the cowboys saw, to share their orientation toward that rising sun. The stones are still warm, though that's impossible. The grass grows differently here, sparse and stunted, as if the ground remembers. Visitors reach out to touch the stone's palm. Against cold rock, and some swear, they feel residual heat. It cannot be true. These fires died more than a century ago. Yet the sensation persists. Reported so frequently, it becomes part of the site's unofficial law. Some visitors report feeling watched, though when they turn around there's nothing but open prairie stretching to the horizon. Others feel an inexplicable sadness, a weight that settles over them like snow. The feeling of being watched is common enough that rangers no longer find it strange when visitors mention it. Perhaps it's simply the awareness that comes from standing in vast open space where the usual boundaries between self and landscape dissolve. Or perhaps some echo of attention remains, the focused awareness of men who sat in these circles scanning the horizon for rescue, for weather changes, for any sign that their situation might improve. That vigilance, repeated night after night, might leave an impression on place. One woman visiting a ghost fire site in Wyoming in 2003 later wrote in the visitor log, "I sat in the circle for an hour and didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but I felt understood." The phrase is cryptic, but perhaps that's appropriate for places that exist between history and mystery. The visitor logs contain hundreds of similar entries, people trying to articulate experiences that resist language. Something happened here. I felt connected to something I can't name. This place knows more than I do, more than I. Some entries are poems, others are simply lists of emotions, sad, peaceful, grateful, unsettled. A few visitors draw pictures in the margins, rough sketches of the circles themselves, of sunrises, of figures that might be human or might be abstract representations of feeling. The archaeologists continue their work, documenting and theorizing, building databases and publishing papers. They map the distribution of ghost fires, analyze the artifacts, search for patterns that might unlock some final truth. Each summer brings new excavations, new data points to add to the accumulated knowledge. Graduate students spend months on the plains, continuing work that began with Sarah Whitmore in 1934. The questions have become more sophisticated, incorporating insights from multiple disciplines: climatology, psychology, cultural anthropology, materials science. But the fundamental mystery remains: what exactly were these places, and what did they mean to the men who built them? But maybe some truths are not meant to be unlocked. Maybe the ghost fires are most valuable as questions rather than answers, as reminders that history is not just what happened but what it felt like to be there when it happened. The academic impulse is toward resolution, toward theories that explain and encompass, but some phenomena resist this treatment, remaining stubbornly multiple, refusing singular interpretation. The ghost fires can be signal fires and sacred sites, survival camps and ritual spaces, practical responses and magical thinking. They contain all these possibilities simultaneously, and perhaps reducing them to any single explanation diminishes what they actually are. In the quiet moments when the wind crosses the plains and makes the grass whisper like voices, you can imagine the cowboys who built these fires, men whose Names we don't know, whose faces appear in no photographs, whose graves are unmarked or lost or never dug. They were young mostly, though. The frontier aged people quickly, boys barely out of their teens, working jobs that required constant physical courage, enduring weather that killed, handling animals that could crush or kick or trample. They came from everywhere. Texas and Tennessee, Ireland and Sweden freed slaves from the South, immigrants seeking work in a new world. The frontier was remarkably democratic in its dangers, killing rich and poor with equal efficiency. They gathered stones from the frozen earth and arranged them with half-frozen hands. They struck sparks in the wind and coaxed flames from wood that didn't want to burn. Imagine the difficulty of this simple task under blizzard conditions: fingers too cold to grip properly, wind that scatters sparks as soon as they appear, snow that melts into water that dampens fuel. Every fire built under such circumstances is a small victory against immense odds. The achievement is not dramatic. No one writes songs about successfully starting fires, but it represents the difference between life and death, between giving up and persisting. One more hour they sat through the night feeding those flames, staying awake because sleeping might mean never waking, and they watched the sky for any sign that the storm might break. And when dawn finally came, if it came, they stood stamped, feeling back into their legs and continued the work of survival. Some sat alone, isolated from their outfits, by circumstance or bad luck, talking to themselves or to absent friends, or to God if they believed. Others, huddled in small groups, sharing warmth and taking turns, sleeping, keeping watch over each other through the darkest hours. The fires they built outlasted them. The stones they arranged still hold that ancient heat, or at least the memory of it. Stone is a patient keeper of information. It holds the chemical signature of what burned against. It preserves the arrangement that human hands imposed, marks the landscape with evidence that persists through all the years that follow. And now, more than a century later, we find these circles and wonder what they meant. We wonder if the men who built them thought about being remembered or if they thought only about making it through one more night. Probably they thought about many things during those long hours, about homes they'd left behind, about people who would mourn them if they died, about debts unpaid and promises unkempt. They thought about being warm again, about spring coming about, whiskey and hot food and clean sheets. They thought about their horses, hoping the animals had found shelter, knowing they probably hadn't. The answer, like so much about the ghost fires, remains suspended between knowing and not knowing. The circles exist, undeniable and strange, scattered across the high plains, like a language we almost understand but can't quite translate. Language requires shared context, agreed-upon meanings, cultural frameworks for interpretation. We lack these connections to the men who built these fires, separated from them by time and by the gap between experience and description. They speak of cold and fire, of isolation and endurance, of the way humans mark their passing through hostile landscapes. They speak of desperation and determination, of practical survival, intertwined with something that might be magic or might just be hope. Hope is its own kind of magic, a refusal to accept defeat that has no logical basis. The cowboys who built these fires had little reason for hope, weather that showed no signs of breaking, fuel running low, help unlikely in the vast distances. Yet they built the fires anyway, arranged the stones with care, oriented everything toward the dawn. They might never see that persistence in the face of overwhelming odds deserves its own acknowledgement, and they remind us that history is not just recorded in documents and dates but written on the land itself, in patterns we're still learning to read. The ghost fires are history, but they're also mystery, and perhaps they should remain both. Official history tells us about the Big Door, through ranch records and newspaper accounts, through economic data about cattle losses and the end of open-range ranching. These sources are important, accurate in what they record, but they miss the individual experiences, the small stories of survival and death, the moments when men made choices that determined whether they would see another day. The ghost fires preserve these moments in a form that resists easy consumption, that demands imagination and empathy from those who would understand them, because some things are more powerful when they resist complete explanation, when they hold space for interpretation and wonder. The cowboys who survived the blizzard didn't write memoirs or give interviews. They just lived through it and continued their work. Literacy rates among working cowboys were mixed, and those who could write often didn't see their experiences as worth recording. This was their life, ordinary and daily, nothing special, even when it involved extremes of hardship and danger. The silence they left behind is frustrating for historians, but perhaps appropriate for men who valued action over words, who measured themselves by what they could do rather than what they could say. Their eloquence was in the doing, in the surviving, in the marks they left on the land. The fires they built are their testament, more eloquent than words could ever be. Stone and ash and arrangement, simple elements combined with intention, creating something that endures long after the flames have gone cold. These circles speak in a language older than writing, the language of human marking and meaning-making that predates alphabets and grammars. They are prehistoric in method, even while historical in date, connecting the cowboys who built them to the deep past of human symbolic behavior. And so the ghost fires remain scattered across the high plains, mapped and studied and protected. Visitors come, stand in the circles, feel whatever it is these places evoke. The grass grows through the stones, patient and slow, gradually reclaiming what humans briefly marked as theirs in another century. Perhaps the circles will be invisible again, absorbed back into the prairie, waiting for the next drought to reveal them, but for now they endure these small monuments to human stubbornness, these declarations that once, in this exact spot, someone refused to surrender to the cold and the dark. They gathered stones, built fire and waited for dawn. That act of waiting, sustained against all reason, is what the ghost fires ultimately commemorate, not the cowboys themselves, not their individual stories or specific identities, but the larger human story of endurance and hope. They remind us what people can survive when survival seems impossible, what they can create even when creation seems futile. Stone circles arranged with frozen hands, fires fed through impossible nights, orientations toward light that might never come, this is the testament the ghost fires offer, written in the most enduring language available, the language of landscape itself, stone and earth, and careful arrangement, simple elements that speak still to anyone willing to stand in those circles and listen. While cowboys froze on the open range and cattle died by the thousands in drifts of snow, a different version of the Wild West was unfolding 300 m south in Dodge City. Here, behind thick walls and frosted glass, the cattle barons were having dinner. The dining room of the Dodge House Hotel glowed with gaslight and warmth. Chandeliers imported from Chicago cast soft light over white tablecloths, polished silverware and plates of roasted beef that had somehow escaped the blizzard's toll. The crystal pendants hanging from the chandeliers caught the light and scattered it across the room in tiny rainbows. Each fixture had traveled by rail from the industrial workshops of the East, wrapped carefully in straw and burlap, insured against damage for sums that exceeded a cowboy's annual wage. The insurance documents themselves represented a kind of faith in systems, a belief that loss could be calculated and transferred in offices in Hartford and Boston. Actuaries had assessed the risk of transporting fragile luxury goods across 2,000 miles of rough country. The men gathered here wore tailored suits rather than trail coats, smelled of bay rum rather than horse sweat. They spoke in the careful language of investment and return, their voices carrying the measured tones of men accustomed to being heard without raising their volume. They owned the cattle dying up north, but ownership at this distance was an abstraction, a figure in a ledger rather than a suffering animal. The physical separation transformed living creatures into numbers, into assets that could be discussed over dinner without troubling the appetite. Their suits had been cut by tailor in Chicago, St. Louis, or even New York, men who understood the particular vanity of Western wealth. The fabric was wool from mills in Massachusetts, dyed in colors that suggested prosperity without ostentation, charcoal, navy, occasional pinstripes of muted distinction. Each suit represented dozens of hours of skilled labor, measurements taken and adjusted, fittings scheduled around the client's convenience. The tailor kept detailed records of each customer's preferences, the exact slope of their shoulders, the precise length of their arms. The buttons were mother of pearl, the linings were silk, the stitching was so fine it seemed to disappear into the fabric itself. These were garments designed to last for years, to be maintained and altered as fashion shifted or bodies changed. James Patterson, who controlled operations for the Swan Land and Cattle Company, sat at the head of the largest table. His company's losses would eventually reach 85%, but tonight the numbers were still speculation, still hypothetical. Patterson wore a watch chain of California gold across his vest, and when he moved it caught the light with the same casual gleam as the chandeliers above. His hands were smooth, uncalloused, the hands of a man who signed papers rather than held res. The watch itself was a Waltham, manufactured in Massachusetts, with precision gearing that kept time to within seconds per day. It had cost more than 3 months of a cowboy's wages, and Patterson consulted it frequently, as if the evening's entertainment operated on a schedule that must be observed. He raised his whiskey glass, imported Kentucky bourbon, not the rotgut, served in trail town saloons, and proposed a toast to resilience and recovery. The other men joined him, crystal clinking in warm air that smelled of cigars and prosperity. The sound of glasses meeting was delicate, refined, nothing like the heavy thunk of tin cups colliding in a bunkhouse. These were Waterford crystal stems, each one worth more than a saddle, transported west with the same careful attention given to any valuable cargo. The whiskey itself was a special reserve, aged for 12 years in charred oak barrels, each bottle hand-labeled and numbered. The distillery in Kentucky had been producing this particular bourbon since before the Civil War, refining its recipe through generations of careful experimentation. In the kitchen, staff worked over coal-burning stoves that had been fed throughout the storm. The heat in the kitchen was almost oppressive, and the cooks and waiters moved through it with the ease of those who have always been warm, who cannot quite imagine what it means to be cold beyond remedy. 3 large stoves occupied the kitchen, their cast-iron bodies radiating heat that made the room feel tropical even while the blizzard raged outside. Coal arrived by the ton from mines in Pennsylvania, stockpiled in bins behind the hotel, fuel enough to last through any conceivable winter emergency. The coal had traveled by rail car in a journey that took weeks, handled by dozens of workers whose names appeared nowhere in the hotel's accounts. Each lump represented ancient forests compressed over millions of years, now burned to warm a single building for a single season. The head cook, a German immigrant named Hermann Schultz, commanded his staff with the precision of a military officer. He had worked in hotel kitchens from Baltimore to San Francisco, and he brought to Dodge City a repertoire of techniques that seemed almost absurdly sophisticated for a cattle town. Schultz had apprenticed in his father's restaurant in Hamburg, learning classical French techniques from chefs who had trained in Paris. He could break down a side of beef with surgical precision, knew 7 ways to prepare potatoes, and could identify herbs by smell. In a darkened room, his staff feared and respected him in equal measure, jumping to attention when he barked orders in his accented English. He tolerated no waste, no shortcuts, no compromises in his kitchen, treating each meal as though it were being prepared for royalty. The beef on the diners' plates came from cattle slaughtered before the worst of the blizzard hit. It was tender and well marbled, prepared with French techniques by a chef who'd been lured west with promises of adventure and wages that exceeded what he'd made in New York. Schultz had roasted the beef with garlic and herbs, basted it with butter imported from Iowa, carved it into portions that would have fed a cowboy for 3 days. The meat was accompanied by potatoes, Dauphinino, green beans, almondine, and a wine reduction sauce that required ingredients not naturally found within 500 miles of Kansas. The potatoes had been sliced paper thin with a mandolin blade, sharpened that afternoon, layered with cream and Gruyere cheese brought from Chicago. The green beans had arrived fresh the week before one of the last deliveries, before the storm closed the rail lines. The sauce alone required an hour of careful attention, wine reduced by half with shallots and herbs finished with bone marrow and butter stirred in at the last moment. It was the kind of preparation that demanded constant vigilance. The heat adjusted by degrees, the timing calibrated to seconds. Between courses, the conversation turned to the weather. Several men had received telegrams from their range managers, reports of heavy losses and difficult conditions. The telegrams had arrived throughout the afternoon, delivered by a boy who trudged through knee-deep snow from the Western Union office. Each message represented a crisis unfolding hundreds of miles away. Translated into expensive words that traveled along copper wires at the speed of electricity. Patterson read portions of one telegram aloud: herd, scattered, heavy mortality, men exhausted. The words were received with solemn nods, appropriate expressions of concern, and then the conversation moved on to other topics. The telegram had cost $3 to send, a sum equal to 3 days' wages for the men it described. Its brevity was not just a stylistic choice but an economic necessity, each word costing money that might better be spent on supplies or salaries. The Western Union operator who transcribed the message had worked through the storm, maintaining the connection between the isolated ranches and the centers of commerce. He tapped out dots and dashes with practiced efficiency, never knowing the content of most messages, just translating human crisis into electrical pulses. No one proposed riding north to help. No one suggested that their presence on the range might improve morale or outcomes. The suggestion would have been received as absurd a category confusion between the classes of men who managed and those who labored. These men owned horses, certainly, but they hadn't sat a saddle in hard conditions for years, perhaps decades. Their riding experience consisted of leisurely afternoon excursions on well-groomed trails or carefully staged roundup visits where they observed from safe distances. The horses they owned were show animals, bred for appearance rather than endurance, stabled in heated barns and groomed daily. This wasn't callousness exactly, but a clear understanding of roles. The men in the dining room provided capital and direction, while the men on the range provided labor and endurance. The system worked because each group stayed in its designated place. To blur these boundaries would threaten the entire structure, would suggest that ownership without presence was somehow illegitimate. Better to maintain the fiction that management and labor were separate spheres requiring separate skills, that a man who could read a balance sheet should not be expected to ride through a blizzard. The division was reinforced through education, through the different worlds these men inhabited from childhood onward. The cattle barons had attended universities or militaries, had studied accounting and law, had been groomed for positions of authority. The cowboys had learned their skills through apprenticeship and necessity, starting as boys doing menial work around ranches. No formal education prepared them for their profession, just the accumulated wisdom passed from experienced hands to greenhorns. After dinner, they retired to the hotel's parlor where a fire burned in a stone hearth large enough to stand in. The heat it produced was almost aggressive, the kind of warmth that makes you drowsy and content. The fireplace had been built with limestone quarried from bluffs along the Arkansas River, each stone cut and fitted by masons who understood that permanence was a form of wealth. The fire consumed split oak logs that had been hauled from Missouri, each cord representing days of labor by men whose names the diners would never know. The limestone had been shaped by Italian stonemasons brought to Kansas specifically for this project, men who worked stone the way sculptors worked marble. They had spent 3 weeks on the fireplace alone, selecting each stone for its size and shape, fitting them together with such precision that mortar seemed almost unnecessary. The chairs arranged around the fire were upholstered in leather and horsehair, manufactured in Grand Rapids and shipped west in pieces. They had been assembled by a furniture craftsman who stayed in Dodge City for 6 months, working on commission for the hotel, before moving on to Denver. The leather had been tanned using processes developed over centuries, treated with oils that kept it supple and gave it a rich smell. The horsehair stuffing provided firmness without rigidity, would hold its shape for decades of use. Each chair was a small masterpiece of joinery and upholstery, the wooden frames assembled without nails, held together by precisely cut mortise and tenon joints. The craftsman who built them had learned his trade through a 7-year apprenticeship. Could identify different woods by feel in darkness. A piano player hired for the evening performed selections from popular songs and operettas. When he played home on the range, several of the men joined in singing about skies not cloudy all day, about discouraging words seldom heard, about the sweetness of the frontier experience. The piano itself was a Steinway baby grand, brought across the plains in a specially constructed wagon with suspension designed to protect its delicate internal mechanism. It required tuning after every significant temperature change, a service provided by a professional tuner who visited monthly from Kansas City. The instrument had cost $4,000, more than most cowboys would earn in a lifetime of work. Its strings were steel, hand-wound and calibrated to precise tensions. Its hammers covered in compressed felt that struck those strings with controlled force. The irony was lost on none of them. But irony is a luxury of the comfortable. They could sing about the range while sitting in armchairs, because they were not currently on that range, not currently testing its reality. Against the myth, the lyrics painted a vision of the West that bore little resemblance to what their employees were experiencing at that moment. No mention of snow that cut like broken glass, of cattle frozen standing up, of men who lost fingers and toes to frostbite while trying to save herds. That would die anyway. The song had been written by a physician who had lived in Kansas briefly before returning east, composing verses based on limited exposure to frontier life. It captured the romance while omitting the reality, the beauty while excluding the brutality. Outside, the same blizzard that was killing their investments continued its work. Snow piled against the hotel's windows, but the windows were double-paned, the walls were thick, and the coal bins were full. The snow formed abstract patterns on the glass, beautiful in its way, transforming the violent chaos of the storm into something aesthetic. Inside, men paused occasionally to admire these patterns, to comment on the fierceness of the weather, with the same detached appreciation they might give a dramatic painting. The double-banked windows represented recent innovation, two sheets of glass separated by an air gap that provided remarkable insulation. They had been installed the previous year at considerable expense, an investment that was now proving its worth. The town of Dodge City, built to serve the cattle trade, had insulated itself against the very conditions that made the cattle trade possible. It was a paradox built into the architecture. The wealth generated by exposing men and animals to harsh elements was spent creating environments where those elements couldn't penetrate. The hotel stood as a monument to this principle, its thick walls and multiple layers of protection representing accumulated profits from summers, when cattle drives arrived weekly and money flowed like whiskey. Every comfort inside had been purchased with the discomfort of others, though this exchange was rarely acknowledged openly. The building's foundation went down 6 feet below the frost line, anchored to bedrock that would support its weight for generations. The walls were 2 feet thick at the base, brick and stone and mortar combined into a barrier that would outlast the men who built it. In smaller boarding houses throughout town, the wives and daughters of ranchers and cattle company managers waited out the storm in relative comfort. They read novels, did needlework, wrote letters that wouldn't be sent until the storm broke. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, whose husband managed operations for a syndicate of Boston investors, sat by a coal stove reading the latest installment of a serialized romance in Harper's Weekly. The story featured a courageous frontiersman who rescued a Gentile Eastern woman from various dangers, all described with thrilling improbability. She had been reading the magazine for 3 years, following various serialized stories that painted the West as a place of adventure and nobility. The stories satisfied something in her, provided excitement that her own life lacked, while never threatening her actual comfort. In the next room her daughter practiced scales on an upright piano, the note slightly flat in the dry winter air. The girl was 16, educated at a finishing school in St. Louis, entirely unprepared for any life except the one of protected comfort she currently inhabited. The girl's education had focused on accomplishments rather than skills, on subjects designed to make her an attractive marriage prospect rather than a capable adult. She could recite poetry, sketch landscapes, play simple pieces on piano and converse pleasantly on approved topics. Some worried about fathers or husbands on the range, but their worry was abstract, unsharpened by direct experience. They imagined cold as an intensification of the chill they felt stepping from the parlor to the bedroom, not as the existential threat it actually was. When they prayed, as many of them did, they asked God to protect their men from danger, without quite understanding what that danger entailed. Their mental images of the storm came from paintings and illustrations, romantically rendered scenes that captured drama but not suffering. Their prayers were sincere but disconnected from the reality. They addressed, spoken in warm rooms, to a God they imagined as benevolent and attentive. They had faith that prayer would be answered, that men who deserved protection would receive it. The social calendar continued despite the weather. There were card parties, informal dances, musical evenings where young women displayed their accomplishments on piano and with voice. Mrs. Avellaneda Cade, wife of a major stockholder in the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, hosted a tea party. On the worst day of the blizzard, 12 women gathered in her sitting room, drank tea from porcelain cups and discussed the upcoming spring social season. The tea service had been a wedding gift from Mrs. Kincaid's mother, shipped from Philadelphia in a custom-built crate lined with velvet. Each cup was painted with delicate roses, the work of craftsmen who spent their lives decorating porcelain for people they would never meet. The tea itself was from China, expensive leaves that had traveled halfway around the world before ending up in a Kansas parlor. It was prepared according to specific protocols Mrs. Convinced had learned from her mother: water heated to exact temperature, leaves steeped for precise duration. The women wore afternoon dresses of wool, serge and bombazine, high-collared and long-sleeved, fashionable but hardly extravagant. Their jewelry was modest: cameo brooches, simple gold chains, wedding bands, the kind of restrained display that suggested both wealth and propriety. The dresses had been purchased from catalogs or during trips to larger cities, selected with care to balance style and appropriateness. Too much ostentation would seem vulgar, too little would suggest insufficient means, and the women navigated these social calculations with practiced skill. The topic of the storm came up naturally, but as context rather than crisis. "The weather has been dreadful," someone remarked, and the others agreed, and then they moved on to discussing the new fabrics that would arrive once the trains could run again. One woman mentioned that her husband had seemed preoccupied by reports from the northern ranges, and the others made sympathetic noises. But the conversation quickly shifted to more pleasant topics, to spring bonnets and garden plans and the social events that would mark the end of winter. The shift was not callous but natural, the result of minds that had never been trained to dwell on hardship. They had been raised to maintain pleasant atmospheres, to smooth over difficult topics, to focus on the agreeable rather than the troubling. It wasn't that they didn't care. Several of these women had real affection for the cowboys who worked their family ranches. But care at a distance is different from care earned through shared suffering, and suffering was not something the parlor class experienced directly. They remembered individual cowboys, men who had worked for their families for years, who had names and faces and personal histories. But even this specificity remained abstract, filtered through the formal distance between employer and employee, between those who owned and those who worked. One woman recalled a particular cowboy who had taught her son to ride, who had carved wooden animals for the children, who had always been respectful and kind. But she knew him only in his moments of service, never in his hours of hardship or doubt. In Denver, even farther from the immediate impact of the storm, the cattle market remained open. Investors bought and sold shares in herds they'd never seen in companies that existed, primarily as entries in account books. The market responded to the blizzard with typical volatility: initial panic, sharp sell-offs, then gradual recovery as buyers recognized that dead cattle meant reduced supply, which would eventually drive prices higher. Catastrophe for the cowboys meant opportunity for the speculators. Men gathered in the Denver Exchange Building, a 4-story structure of red brick and stone that housed the machinery of Western finance. They watched a chalkboard where prices were updated by the quarter hour, numbers that represented living animals reduced to abstract value. The building had been constructed just 2 years earlier, designed to project permanence and seriousness. Its lobby featured marble floors. Its offices had walnut paneling. Its windows were tall and let in abundant light. That made the work of commerce feel clean and rational. Some of these men had never traveled to a ranch, had never seen a cattle drive or witnessed the actual work their investments funded. Their knowledge came from reports and statistics, from carefully curated tours of model operations, from the confident presentations of men like James Patterson. They understood cattle as commodities, as assets that appreciated or depreciated according to market forces. The actual animals, their individual lives, their suffering, their deaths, remained theoretical, never confronted in specific and undeniable form. At the Windsor Hotel, perhaps the finest establishment between Chicago and San Francisco, railroad magnates and mining barons gathered for their own version of weathering the storm. Here the luxury was even more pronounced: Belgian carpets, Italian marble, champagne rooms where a single evening's entertainment cost more than a cowboy earned in a year. The hotel's lobby featured a grand staircase of carved mahogany, each Alistair hand-turned by craftsmen in St. Louis. The carpet beneath it had been woven in Brussels, using patterns designed specifically for the Windsor, incorporating Western motifs: cattle, skulls, mountains, wild roses, rendered in European sophistication. The mahogany had come from forests in Honduras, logged by workers paid pennies per day, shipped north in vessels that carried luxury goods one direction and raw materials the other. Each piece had been selected for its grain and color, the darker woods commanding premium prices. The dining room ceiling had been painted by an Italian artist who spent 2 years in Denver executing elaborate murals of classical scenes, gods and heroes corded across. The plaster, their muscular forms and flowing robes, utterly disconnected from the harsh landscape visible through the windows. The artist had worked from scaffolding 30 feet above the floor, mixing his pigments fresh each morning, applying them in layers that would remain vivid for decades. He had been paid handsomely but had found Denver barbarous, counting the days until he could return to Florence. These men owned the infrastructure that made the cattle industry possible: the railroads that shipped beef east, the stockyards that processed the animals, the banks that financed the operations. They were several steps removed from the actual work of ranching, and the distance provided both comfort and profit. Their wealth came from facilitation rather than production, from controlling the channels through which value flowed rather than creating value themselves. They owned the metaphorical pipes through which the industry's water ran, and they charged for every drop. One such man, Hamilton Pierce, had made his fortune consolidating small cattle operations into larger corporations. He viewed the blizzard as a correction, an elimination of inefficient operators who lacked the capital reserves to absorb catastrophic loss. Pierce had pioneered the application of industrial principles to ranching, treating cattle not as individual animals but as units of production. His companies operated on scales that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier, managing tens of thousands of head across multiple territories. He had studied the consolidation happening in manufacturing back east, the way small workshops were being replaced by large factories. He saw no reason the same principles couldn't apply to ranching, to agriculture, to any enterprise that could benefit from economies of scale over brandy. In the Windsor smoking room he explained his theory to associates: the strong will survive, gentlemen, the men who plan properly, who diversified their investments, who understood that nature is simply another variable to be calculated, they will emerge from this winter stronger than before. His listeners nodded, recognizing the logic, even if they felt vaguely uncomfortable with its coldness. But discomfort was easy to ignore when you were warm, well-fed and insulated by wealth from the consequences of your own theories. The brandy they drank was Napoleonic cognac, distilled in France decades earlier and aged in oak barrels before making the long journey across the Atlantic and then across the continent. Each glass represented more concentrated value than most cowboys would see in a month of hard labor. The cognac had been produced by a family that had been making brandy for 4 generations, using grapes from specific vineyards in the cognac region. The distillation process alone took months, the aging took years, and the result was a liquid that commanded prices that seemed absurd for something that would be consumed in minutes. The smoking room itself was a study in masculine luxury, leather chairs the color of tobacco, walls panned in walnut, air thick with the mingled smoke of Cuban cigars and Turkish cigarettes. It was a space designed to make men feel important, to reinforce their sense of mastery over the world beyond its walls. The cigars had been rolled by hand in Havana, each one inspected for quality, wrapped in cedar sleeves, shipped in humidified containers. The cigarettes were custom blended, their tobacco sourced from 3 different regions and mixed according to a formula that had taken years to perfect. The contrast between these two worlds, the warm parlors of Dodge City and Denver. The frozen range of the Dakota Territory was not just geographic but philosophical. One world believed in mastery and control, in the power of capital and organization to overcome any obstacle. This belief was not entirely unfounded. After all, these men had built railroads across mountains, established cities in deserts, created vast fortunes from territories that had been wilderness within living memory. Their success reinforced their conviction that proper planning and sufficient capital could solve any problem. They had witnessed the conquest of distance through railroad, the conquest of darkness through electric light, the conquest of disease through modern medicine. Each triumph over natural limitation strengthened their faith that human ingenuity could prevail over any challenge. The other world knew different truths. That nature could not be mastered, only endured. That control was an illusion, maintained only until the wind began to blow. That survival often came down to luck and stubbornness rather than planning or wisdom. The Cowboys had learned these lessons through direct experience, through nights when their choices came down to survival or death, with no middle ground. They understood in their bodies what the parlor class only knew as theory, that the West's promises were conditional and often revoked without warning. The men in the parlor would not have denied these truths if confronted with them directly. But they didn't have to confront them. And that was the point of the parlor, of the double-banked windows and the coal-burning stoves in the distance itself. They could acknowledge the hardship of frontier life in the abstract, while never feeling its weight on their own bodies. They could speak admiringly of cowboy resilience without ever testing their own, could profit from risk while transferring that risk entirely to others. Furthermore, they could experience the frontier as idea rather than reality, could participate in its mythology while avoiding its demands. And when the blizzard finally passed, when the death counts were tallied and the losses calculated, they would absorb the financial impact and continue their operations because they had the reserves to do so. Their companies were structured precisely for this purpose, capitalized at levels that allowed them to survive shocks that would destroy smaller operators. Loss was simply another column in the accounting books, painful but not fatal, absorbed through reduced dividends rather than personal ruin. The corporate structure itself provided insulation, distributing risk among multiple investors so that no single person bore catastrophic loss. It was another way of achieving what the double-banked windows achieved, a buffer between the harsh reality outside and the comfort within. The cowboys who survived would return to work for them because there were no other options. The ones who died would be replaced because there were always more men willing to test themselves against the West's promises. The labor market functioned on desperation and hope, on the constant supply of young men who believed the mythology more than the reality. For every cowboy who froze to death or gave up and returned east, another arrived with fresh optimism and empty pockets. These young men came from farms where mechanization was eliminating jobs, from cities where factory work was grinding and degrading. The West represented freedom, even if that freedom came packaged with hardship and risk, and the system would continue, with warmth concentrated at the top and cold distributed across the bottom, because that was how the system was designed, not through malice, necessarily, but through the natural sorting of a society that valued capital over labor, comfort over endurance, the safety of distance over the honesty of shared risk. The architecture of inequality was built into every transaction, every employment contract, every corporate charter. Those with capital made the rules, and the rules, unsurprisingly, favored those who made them, creating feedback loops that concentrated wealth and dispersed hardship. Back in Dodge City, as the evening wore on and the whiskey flowed more freely, the conversation in the Dodge House parlor turned philosophical. Someone raised the question of what separated civilization from barbarism, refinement from savagery. The question had been prompted by a recent article in Harper's Monthly about the closing of the frontier, about what would replace the lawlessness and violence that had characterized Western settlement. The men present considered themselves pioneers of a new phase, bringing order and civilization to what had been chaos. The consensus emerged that civilization was precisely this: the ability to insulate oneself from nature's cruelty, to create pockets of warmth and order in a cold and chaotic world. By this definition, the men in the parlor were civilization's highest achievement, having distanced themselves most completely from discomfort. They spoke of progress as measured by distance from necessity, by layers of protection between the human body and the natural world. The more servants, the more mechanisms, the more walls between oneself and the weather. These were the markers of advancement. No one mentioned that their comfort was built on other men's discomfort, that the profits funding this evening's entertainment came from cowboys who were at that moment struggling to survive on the frozen range. The thought probably occurred to some of them, but it remained unspoken. To speak it would be to acknowledge that civilization, as they defined it, was not a universal good but a local advantage, that their warmth required someone else's cold, their leisure someone else's labor, their security someone else's risk. Because to speak it would be to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth that their civilization was parasitic, dependent on the suffering of those who actually engaged with the frontier, rather than merely investing in it. And acknowledgement would demand response, would require either justification or change. Change was unthinkable. The entire structure of their wealth and power depended on the current arrangement. Justification was possible, but exhausting, requiring mental gymnastics that became more difficult when stated explicitly rather than simply assumed. So the conversation moved to safer topics: politics, gossip, plans for spring expansion. Despite the winter's losses, the piano player continued his cheerful melodies. The fire burned warm, and the snow piled higher against the windows. Someone told a humorous story about a tenderfoot who'd arrived from Boston expecting the West to match dime novel descriptions. The story concluded with the tenderfoot fleeing back east after a single night sleeping outdoors, and the men laughed with the easy superiority of those who had never had to sleep outdoors themselves. The laughter was genuine, the story entertaining, and no one examined the cruelty implicit in finding humor in another's discomfort. The tenderfoot became a symbol of Eastern softness, confirming the self-image of these Western men, even though their own relationship with hardship was theoretical. Talk turned to the coming spring, to the roundup that would reveal the true extent of the winter's damage. Plans were made, strategies discussed, contingencies considered, all with the assumption that, however bad the losses, operations would continue. Outside, the blizzard continued its democratic work, recognizing no distinction between cattle owned by corporations and cattle owned by small operators. But inside, the distinctions remained clear. Some people survived winters in parlor, while others survived them on horseback. The storm killed without regard to ownership structures or market valuations, but the ability to absorb those losses was distributed according to precise hierarchies. Nature might be indifferent to human arrangements, but human society was not, and recovery would follow the logic of capital rather than the randomness of weather. And when spring came, as it always did, the fundamental arrangement would remain unchanged. The cowboys would round up what cattle survived, drive them to market and collect their modest wages. They would bury their dead, nurse their frostbite and sign on for another season, because the alternatives were worse. Some would move on to other work, other territories, but most would stay in the only profession they knew, the only life they'd prepared for. The cattle barons would assess their losses, restructure their operations and continue building their empires. The system would persist because it was designed to persist, built to survive disruptions by distributing suffering downward while concentrating security upward. Financial losses would be absorbed through complex mechanisms: insurance payouts, adjusted stock valuations, renegotiated loans. Individual investors might suffer, but the system itself would adapt and continue because the system was larger than any individual participant. This was the other truth of the Wild West, the one that doesn't appear in legends or songs, that freedom and hardship were intimately connected. That the same frontier that promised independence to cowboys also created the conditions for their exploitation. That the romance of the open range was sustained by men who experienced very little romance, only cold and exhaustion and the slim hope of making it through another winter. The mythology served everyone's purposes. It attracted the labor force, justified the low wages, provided a cultural narrative that made brutality seem heroic. If cowboys saw themselves as free individuals rather than exploited workers, they were less likely to organize, less likely to demand better conditions. The evening at the Dodge House ended, as such evenings did, with handshakes and plans to reconvene, with men retiring to comfortable beds in heated rooms with the assurance that morning would bring warm breakfast and renewed opportunity. Outside, the storm screamed on, but inside all was peaceful, prosperous and profoundly insulated from consequence. The final logs were placed on the fire, the piano player collected his fee and departed into the snowy streets. The waiters cleared the last glasses and extinguished the gaslights in the parlor. The hotel settled into the quiet rhythms of night, its guests already deep in warm sleep and 300m North cowboys huddled around dying fires or no fires at all, waiting for dawn with no certainty they would see it, sustained only by the stubbornness that keeps a body moving when reason suggests stopping. Two worlds, one storm and the vast distance between comfort and survival that no amount of romanticizing could bridge. The blizzard of 1886 eventually passed, as all storms do. Spring came slowly to the northern plains, melting the snow and revealing what had been hidden beneath thousands of cattle carcasses scattered across the range. Ghost fires marked in stone and a frontier forever changed. Charles Goodnight rebuilt his herd over the following years, though he never again achieved the same scale of operation. The men who survived the winter carried its marks forever in frostbitten fingers, in nightmares about endless white, in a quiet understanding that they'd seen something most people never see, the absolute limit of human endurance. The cattle industry recovered, evolved, became more cautious. Ranchers learned to keep smaller herds, to maintain emergency feed supplies, to respect what winter could do when it decided to remind humans of their place. The cowboys who died in the blizzard left few traces. Some have markers in town cemeteries, names carved in wood that has long since rotted away. Others remain where they fell their bones, scattered by weather and time, anonymous contributions to the soil they tried so hard to survive on. The ghost fires still mark the landscape, though each year there are fewer people who remember what they mean. Archaeologists document them, tourists occasionally visit them, but their true purpose, as monuments to endurance, as prayers made of stone and ash, is slowly being forgotten. In Dodge City and Denver, in all the warm places where the cattle barons gathered, the blizzard became a story, then a statistic, then barely a memory. The system they built persisted and evolved into modern corporations, modern markets, modern distances between those who own and those who work. But out on the range, where the wind still cuts across open prairie and winter still arrives like judgment, the memory persists differently, not in stories or statistics, but in the land itself, in the strange silence that falls over certain places, in the way the grass grows differently where cattle died, where fires burned, where men made their last stands against impossible cold. If you stand on the high plains at dawn, when the light comes from the southeast and the air is still cold, from the night you might hear it, a sound like leather creaking, like horses stamping, like men murmuring to animals who are beyond comfort. It's probably just the wind, just your imagination, filling silence with meaning. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the echo of that winter still reverberating through time, still insisting on being remembered by those willing to listen. The cowboys didn't ask to be heroes. They just asked to survive, to make it through one more night, one more storm, one more winter. Most of them did survive, though what they survived into was often harder than what they survived through. They grew old, working the same ranges where they'd frozen, doing the same work for the same modest wages, watching the frontier close and the legends build around. A life they knew to be much less romantic than the stories suggested. They became relics of their own era, living reminders of a time that was already being mythologized into something it never was. When they died in town beds, mostly not on the range as they might have preferred, they left behind photographs where their eyes look older than their years. They left behind silence, the stubborn refusal to talk much about that winter or any winter, the understanding that words couldn't capture what they'd lived through. And they left behind the knowledge passed down to children and grandchildren that survival is not the same as victory, that making it through something terrible doesn't erase. The terror only proves you were strong enough or lucky enough or stubborn enough to endure it. The modern world has insulated us from that kind of cold. We have central heating and weather forecasts, emergency services and supply chains, all the infrastructure that separates us from nature's worst moods. We can read about the blizzard of 1886 while sitting in comfortable rooms, can imagine what it must have been like, without ever truly knowing. And maybe that's as it should be. Maybe each generation earns the right to be warmer, safer, more protected than the last. But something is also lost in that comfort, the knowledge that humans can endure almost anything, that the body and mind are capable of surviving conditions that seem impossible, that when everything is stripped away warmth, safety, hope, what remains is a kind of animal stubbornness that refuses to quit. The cowboys who lived through the Big Dire knew this. They knew it in their frozen fingers, in their frostbitten toes, in the nightmares that would wake them years later gasping in warm beds, convinced for a moment that they were still out there in the white tonight. As you drift toward sleep in your own warm bed, spare a thought for those men, not romantic cowboys of legend, but actual humans who woke in darkness, pulled on frozen boots and rode into storms that wanted to kill them. Remember that they did this not once, but over and over, day after day, week after week, that they kept going when stopping would have been easier, would have been understandable, would have been forgiven. Remember that the West they experienced was not the West of movies or novels, but a place where survival itself was victory enough, where making it to spring meant you'd won, even if you'd lost everything else along the way. And as sleep takes you, as you sink into the comfort of your modern insulation from the world's harshness, let the image fade, a man on horseback, wrapped in frozen leather, riding through endless white toward a dawn he cannot see but refuses to stop believing in. The wind screams, the cold bites, and he keeps riding, because that's what the cowboys did. They kept riding. And somewhere in the high plains, in the stone circles and scattered bones and strange silences, that truth remains, not written in books or carved in monuments, but written on the land itself, in a language of endurance that requires no translation. The blizzard passed, the spring came, the grass grew back, and the cowboys, those who survived and those who did, became part of the landscape. They'd struggled so hard to live in dust and memory, stone and story, slowly fading into the same silence that took them. Rest now, let the warmth hold you, sleep in comfort, knowing that others endured the cold, so that we might remember what endurance looks like. The wind still blows across the Dakota plains, the snow still falls each winter, and somewhere in that white expanse the ghosts of cowboys ride eternal, forever checking herds that no longer exist, forever chasing spring that never quite arrives. But that's their burden now, not yours. Sleep peacefully, dream warmly, and when you wake, remember only this: they survived so you could be comfortable. That's monument.